I am going to repeat a few things that I've already said on this very podium, for which I apologise if people have heard them before. My interest in this relates to, well, actually, it sort of springs from a book that I wrote about the weird world of geoengineering as a case study of emerging technology, and from that, I got involved in a few discussions about responsible research and innovation that I'll say something about in a second. At a conference on responsible research and innovation, I got angry and had a rant about excellence, which is, like for a science policy person, it's like stealing candy from a baby, right? It's a bit unfair target. But that then turned into a blog post, and I gave a talk here developing some of these ideas. And I mean, it's to say that I'm against excellence is sort of a bit too easy. What I'm really interested in is thinking about the politics of the legitimation that takes place around the word excellence. Geoengineering is almost irrelevant to this story. I put this up because I've got a book, for God's sake. But it is just to give you an indicator of what that argument is about. It's a case study at one level of the difficulty of separating goods from bads in contentious emerging science and technology. It's a discussion of what counts as good science when science is problematically connected to these ridiculous, absurd futures. And it reports on the ambivalence of scientists themselves involved in what at one level was the world's most mundane experiment, squirting water into the sky, right, which everybody agreed was risk-free, and yet also was an experiment with the future of the planet at some level. But the excellence discussion zooms out to the level of national, in particular European science policies. Here's just an indicator. We could all probably come up with our own national case studies of the crass use of the term excellence. This is the British Science and Innovation Strategy that mentions excellence 40 times. It doesn't mention fairness or justice or inequality or those sorts of things once, but it mentions excellence 40 times. And the framing of excellence here is a fairly conventional one, I guess you could say. Here's a review that was done by Paul Nurse, ex-president of the Royal Society, which is currently shaping British science policy, which again says similar things about excellence, but at least Paul Nurse is explicit enough to admit, in effect, that excellence tells you nothing at all about quality and everything about who's making the decisions. And that's the point that we could probably, in this room, I don't need to force down your throats. We've got it in Horizon 2020. Through a sort of iconographical mistake, excellent science and better society are quite a long way away from one another in that absurd European diagram. I'm not sure if those blocks, he's just thrown them up into the sky or if they are about to land on him, but these are the questions we're not allowed to ask when it comes to European policymaking. And the contradictions with excellence reveal themselves without us having to do too much work. So this is a couple of meetings, one of which I was involved with, that took place under the Danish presidency. This is the Danish then Minister for Science and Higher Education arguing at a conference called, and this isn't even a joke, Excellence 2012, Excellence Revisited, the Value of Excellence. He says excellence is the way forward. Exactly a week later, was a conference that I and various others here were at on responsible research and innovation, where, without admitting any sort of contradictions here, he made a very interesting speech, I thought, in which he actually problematized the idea of the best science in the world and instead said what would the best science for the world look like, which is, for an STS audience, quite an interesting statement for a minister to make. Responsible research and innovation, as it's being imagined in the European context, is about, well, we don't know quite what it's about, right? But it brings together, at one level, it's about advancing particular policy goals that aren't just to do with scientific excellence, right? And we could dig into those, but the central concern for STS people and the science policy community is a familiar one about aligning science and innovation with societal needs. So this is my representation of Nelson's classic Moon and the Ghetto framing. How come it was in the 1970s that we could put a man on the moon but not solve the problems of our own ghetto? The same question got put into stark relief actually by The Economist, of all people, who asked in 2012, how can a country, India, that can't feed its own population, send a probe to Mars? And this forces a set of questions about science and innovation priorities, also a set of questions about solvable and wicked problems. But these are the questions that responsible research and innovation is, in some way, a current response to. Do I want to be mean about Bill Gates? Yeah, why not? There is this classic sort of there is this classic narrative in which scientific excellence plus wishful thinking equals the solution to all our problems. The trick is never put a date on it. Bill Gates. C.P. Snow made the same mistake in 1959, saying that the gap between rich and poor would be sorted out by the year 2000, and we know that technology is probably implicated in the widening of that gap. I just want to end here because I don't want to be gonged or whatever Silvio's equivalent of it is. So excellence, I think, it's transparently a Polanyian philosophy. And if you go back to the Republic of Science, you see a description of excellence, which he is very explicit about in terms of his political philosophy of science, that this is explicitly a negative diagnosis, as a doctor would say. This is about what this is not. And I think excellence is only really sensibly understood as being not about public opinion, not about societal goals, not about industrial demands, and all the rest of it. The question is why, I guess, politically, we let scientists and policymakers get away with the lazy deploying of this term. This is, I think, a really nice analogy. This is Michael Young writing in the 1950s, I think, about meritocracy. So meritocracy is a word that politicians of all stripes are quite happy to use now, without any recognition at all that the word was invented as a satire. Michael Young wrote this book as a satire on an idealized model of society in which you characterize people according to their merits and then rank them accordingly. And it has become a completely unironic term in British politics. And I think excellence is sort of the same sort of term, that if you push people, they would recognize that, of course, it needs to be multidimensional, of course there are problems with it, and yet it just becomes extremely easy for people to lazily deploy. Without wishing to get personal, I mean, I think Helga Novotny's role in this debate is an extremely interesting one. She and the gang who did this book, you will probably know it, demand that excellence needs to be broadened. And I think that would be a sort of, a lot of us in this room would share that conclusion. The realization, I think, since the 1990s is that it hasn't. It's been narrowed, and that therefore there's a strong case to be made for abandoning it, calling it out whenever it is used, and treating it for the empty term that it is. And that's where I'll end. Thank you, everybody.